Wondery's shocking true crime podcast, Over My Dead Body, is back for a third season with a story about corruption, betrayal, and the secrets of a fallen hero. Follow Over My Dead Body, Season 3, Fox Lake, on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening right now.
Wondery.
From Wondery, I'm your host, Tracy Pattin, and this is a special episode of Hollywood and Crime. On February 1st, 1922, famed film director William Desmond Taylor was shot dead in his home in Los Angeles. Among the suspects were teen film star Mary Miles Minter, who had an unrequited crush on Taylor, 20 years her senior. Then there was Minter's controlling mother, Charlotte Shelby, and Mabel Normand, a top comedic star and close friend of Taylor, plus many other suspects, including Taylor's butler. The case was unsolved for more than 90 years until 2015, when in his book, Tinseltown, Murder, Morphine and Madness at the Dawn of Hollywood, William J. Mann revisited this complex and intriguing murder case. Instead of the original suspects, Mann identified a different killer. William J. Mann is an American novelist, biographer, and Hollywood historian. He was also a consultant on our series, Murder in Hollywoodland. He's here today to talk more about this story, how he came across it, Hollywood in the 1920s, and he also talks about the role of women during that era.
We get support from Believe Her, a new true crime podcast from Lemonada and Spiegel and Grau. In September 2017, young mom Nikki Adamando shot and killed her partner, Chris Grover. She was sentenced to 19 years to life in prison for murder. Through rare access to police audio, a month-long trial, conversations with Nikki, and original reporting, journalist Justine Vanderloon lays out the killing, the evidence, and the aftermath. As this 6-part series unfolds, listeners will put together different pieces of a disturbing puzzle. One thing is clear: perception is not reality. Believe Her is a riveting chronicle that grapples with assumptions we make about domestic and sexual violence, the long reach of trauma, and the ways in which survival is criminalized, leaving us shocked at how far people will go to avoid seeing what's right in front of them. Believe Her premieres October 21st. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
So welcome, William. It's so great to talk to you.
Well, it's great to be here.
I love your book. It's so fascinating. And the way we left off with our series in episode 6 was Gibby, a.k.a. Mrs. Lewis, dying on her kitchen floor and confessing. I am so fascinated about that. I was so shocked to find out that it was Gibby Gibson. So tell us about that. Tell us about how you found that out.
Well, I've been a fan of this story for the longest time. And it was always a story that I, when I had a few spare moments and doing other research projects, I would look into it, read about it, read everything that had ever been written about it. There's a website, Taylorology.com, where there's so many wonderful stories about this, and people have come in and added new information. And I became a fan. I've been an addict, really, to this story. And I always knew that the answer was not what we'd always been told. I knew that this had to be another story. It had to be something else that nobody had ever looked into, either at the time or later on. And it was the story of this old woman on her deathbed confessing to the crime that just fascinated me. And I said, could this possibly be true? I mean, it felt like, many people confessed to crimes they never committed. And was she delirious? What was going on? But I felt there was something there to dig into and more to be found. And so I set off to do it and just began researching every possible avenue of thought and really began to get a sense of who she was and how she was connected to the story. I feel like this is the answer for the story, but people have to listen to the podcast and read the book to find out if they agree with me.
I think it's so interesting that she was just the night before with Ray Long's mother watching Ralph Story's Los Angeles show, and she blurted out. It's just like there's so many strange synchronicities to this story. And what's interesting also is that she stayed under the radar for so many years.
Well, yeah. And, I believe that she did that deliberately for the longest time. One of the interesting coincidences was that right at the time the investigation was opened up again in the 1930s, Gibby gets married and goes to Asia. She moves around the other side of the planet so that nobody could come and ask her any questions. Because I do believe there was something that connected her, that we know that there were papers, at least in 1924, there had been a message from the FBI to the Los Angeles detectives at the DA's office saying, hey, you might want to consider this case implicating Margaret Gibson. That was never followed up. But somewhere that probably remained in the investigators' files. So I believe Gibby stayed under the radar because she knew at any moment she could be called in.
And Will, do you think that she was the actual shooter? I know there's this whole thing about the blackmail gang. So what do you think about that piece of it?
It's clear to me that Gibby was guilt-ridden over this, but that she was not the actual murderer herself. But I believe that it was the information that she gave to Don Osborne and that he shared with his blackmail gang. I believe that is the information that got Taylor killed. My theory is that a hood by the name of Blackie Madsen pulled the trigger. He matches the description of the eyewitness who saw somebody leaving Taylor's house. And it seems like this was something that was very plausible. Madsen had reacted impulsively in this way before, had shot someone else before. It all began to add up. But no, Gibby herself didn't pull the trigger. It was very clear right from the beginning that Faith McLean, the one eyewitness, saw a man leaving the house. And all of the later theories that said it was a woman just don't fit with the evidence of the one eyewitness.
And what about the motive? Okay, so Blackie did it, you think, impulsively. I could see how that would happen. But why? Why would they kill him?
Well, I don't believe it was an intentional killing. Ed King, the lead detective, always felt that it was an impulsive killing, that it was something that had gone wrong. It was either an emotional argument or an altercation. And that's clearly what happens if you look at the way the bullet went through Taylor's body and we see the chair that was tipped over. My theory is that when Taylor discovered Blackie Madsen in his apartment, he lifted the chair in defense of himself. And Madsen instinctively pulled his gun out and shot him. From below, Taylor's, over 6 feet tall. Blackie was about 5'6", and he's on the ground. That explains the trajectory of the bullet through the body. But I believe he wasn't there to kill him. I believe he was there to try to shake him down and force him to give them their next blackmail payment.
This case is so complex. When I look at all the other suspects, and obviously Charlotte Shelby, who I was thinking, of course, she must have done it. There's a whole story about her, and people were so sure, right? In the Washington Post article, Will, you say, in order to solve the case, you must pay close attention to what the film industry was going through in the 1920s. Hollywood knew how to manipulate a crime. I think that's so fascinating. So do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, sure. One of the things that so makes this case and this story so enduring, why people still talk about it nearly 100 years later, is because of, as what you were just saying, that the cast of characters are archetypal. They're fascinating. We've got, the stage mother, we've got the ingenue, we've got the best friend, we've got the butler, all of these great suspects. It's like the game of Clue, it's like, who did it? And that's why people really love this story. And people don't really want it solved either. It's like, let's not take away the fun. We want to keep speculating here. And I encourage people to do that. Keep speculating. What's absolutely true is that to really understand this story, however, you have to understand Hollywood. You have to understand what else was going on. It was high stakes at this point. The movies had made a lot of money for a lot of people very fast, and now there were pressures from the outside to start taking some of those profits away. So the industry had learned how to manipulate its media and its publicity. So they were not going to allow this scandal to take them down.
And it was, of course, so interesting how the studio heads were in the apartment right after.
Oh, immediately.
And covering things up. And
yeah,
it was such a different time in the early 1920s. And then you put in all the drugs. Mm-hmm. There was so much underbelly going on then, so many hidden things. And the studio seemed to run everything, right? The studio had Zucker. He was so powerful. And the actors, of course, were afraid.
Yes, absolutely. They were terrified. And when Henry Peavy, Taylor's butler, found him, he knew that the first thing to do was not to call the police. It was to call the studio. That was just gospel. Everyone knew that. You don't call the police, you call the studio. They take care of things. And even when the police finally come and they see that Charles Eiton is there, who's the number 3 guy at the studio, the fixer, they knew to back off. The studio makes these decisions, not the police. And that's not really all that hard to understand. I think it's similar today. People in power, positions of influence, are able to get away with things that other people can't. And so the studio had a lot of power in the 1920s.
And I think it's interesting that you have said that Hollywood in 1922 reminds you of Hollywood today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's the same things. The stars are becoming more famous for their off-screen behavior than any of the work that they do. We have the government trying to control and regulate the industry. We have social conservatives and religious conservatives complaining that Hollywood is destroying the morals of the country. The new media, everyone's trying to get a piece of it. It's exactly the same if that's what's going on today.
It's just such a fascinating thing that it really hasn't changed all that much in that way. We get support from Talkspace. We all have something we're working on. It could be a career change, finding a partner, or procrastinating less. The hard part isn't identifying your goals. It's taking action. Talkspace Online Therapy can match you with a licensed therapist, all from the comfort of your phone or computer. With Talkspace, you can get support and accountability every day to talk through challenges and stay on track with whatever you're working toward. The service is secure and private, using the latest encryption technology to store client information. The bottom line is that we all need to talk sometimes. Therapy has helped me immensely, and I know it can help you too. And Talkspace wants to give more of us the support we deserve at a price we can afford. As a listener of this podcast, you get $100 off your first month on Talkspace. To match with your perfect therapist, go to Talkspace.com or download the app. Make sure to use the code Hollywood to get $100 off your first month and show your support for the show. That's Talkspace.com, code Hollywood. It's interesting that you are so passionate about old Hollywood as I am. How did you get passionate about it? How did you get so interested in that era?
It goes back to when I was very, very young, and I would beg my parents to stay up late to watch these old movies on television because this was before the internet and before Blockbuster videos. And so I had to wait to what was shown at 11:30 at night on my local NBC outlet. So a very old obsession. What always interests me, too, is how things got their start. I'm always interested. I'm a historian. I teach history here in Connecticut. I'm always interested in how culture begins. How did things get to be the way they are today? And for me, as much as I love movies, I'm really more interested in the social history of them. What was going on? Why did these people come together to make these kinds of films? How did they sell them? What did these films mean for the public? What do these films tell us about ourselves? That's really always been my interest. Go back and look at these films, not just because they're just wonderful to watch, but also what are they telling us about ourselves and our culture?
And it's also interesting back then that women had some power. There were women directors. I mean, I'm a big fan of Alla Nazimova and her story, and of course, Mary Pickford.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's Hedda and Lawley and their power back then. And it's fascinating. And yet that seems to have dissipated, at least for a while. I don't know if women have really that much power right now in Hollywood. They've come partway, but they haven't really matched the power of the men in Hollywood. But especially back then, for these women to be able to direct and produce.
Absolutely. And, one of the reasons why this story resonates for today as well is that we think about the realities that we've come to see over the last couple of years through the Me Too movement. This is not a new problem. This was going on from the very beginning of Hollywood. Women had to work twice as hard to get half as much as men get. All three of our leads here, Mabel Normand, Margaret Gibson, and Mary Miles Minter, were all sexually assaulted and sexually harassed by men in the industry, by powerful men in the industry. They all responded and reacted to that in different ways. Some of them were destroyed by it. Others were able to claim some triumph in their lives. I think Mabel Normand is one of those women you were talking about. She was one of the first women to run her own studio, although it was subsidized by Max Sennett. But it was Mabel Normand's production. She was making the decisions. And I think if the scandal hadn't happened, we would have seen Mabel Normand become a real power player in the industry. So it's an interesting story. And I really think Tinseltown, the book that I wrote, is really a book about women and about women's agency and being able to rise above this terrible tragedy and make some lives for themselves.
It really is. You're right that it is a book about women. And as an old Hollywood sort of an aficionado, I'm just passionate about that era, that's what I find is most fascinating are the women then and what they had to deal with. Because also you think about people like Clara Bow, who her story is so sad and so many people don't realize what these women went through back then and how bad it was.
Right.
The struggles were intense.
And yet Clara Bow was incredibly popular and had quite a bit of power for a while. In many ways, Mary Pickford helped define the industry. And if Mary Pickford had her way, we would have ended up making movies in a different way. United Artists was a whole different model for filmmaking and for film production and for film distribution and exhibition than what Adolf Zukor was putting in, which was vertical integration of the industry. Whereas Mary Pickford and the rest of them at United Artists, but it was really Mary Pickford's vision in many ways, was that films needed to be a creative and collaborative endeavor and that they were much more egalitarian. And it was about producing art and then allowing the business to take the art out rather than the business controlling the art. So it was a model that Pickford and others tried to set up and that people like Zukor eventually squashed and said, no, we're going to run it in a factory kind of way and industrialize the American film.
Those studio heads just were so awful to women. They just were.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
They had very little respect for women. And for women to rise above all that was a huge feat.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And yet at the same time, the reason women did have some power was that because women were the largest part of the audience and women were making the choices about what movies are to be seen. Women had an awful lot of influence on creating movie stars and deciding what pictures were going to be successful. So the female movie stars, Pickford and Swanson and Clara Bow, they were in some ways even more popular than most of the men because they were able to draw in larger audiences. It's an interesting dynamic. The studio heads were exploiting the women that were working for them, but at the same time, those women were the ones that were paying the bills in many ways.
And also during that time of the silent films, your book really focuses on that era. But in, of course, 1927, things changed. And that sure shifted Hollywood in a big, big way. I mean, there's so many stars that were just so afraid. It was a whole different experience when talkies came into play.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And one of my great joys, and when I look back at the early part of my career, was as a college student, I got to interview Lillian Gish. And Lillian Gish said to me, when movies learned to talk, she said, we lost, 90% of our audience because we had lost that kind of universal appeal. The sense that movies were art. They were a way of telling a story that was different than anything else. It was a whole stylized structure in terms of how stories were told. And not that I don't love talking films, and there's the films of the 30s and 40s and the 50s, but there's something very special about the silent film because it's telling a story and imparting feelings and emotions in a way that has never been done before and really has never been done since. And it's beautiful. It's a lost art form. It
is. You're so right. And it was such a time of freedom for them. There's so many stories about the sets when it was the silent films were happening.
Right.
It was noisy and kind of crazy and fun.
Yes, right.
And then all of a sudden, and Clara Bow, of course, talked about that with the microphone in her face.
Yes, right.
And it just paralyzed her. And then everything's quiet on the sets.
Right.
And they have to remember lines.
Right. Yeah.
It just was like a huge shift. And it's a part of our Hollywood history that's not really talked about all that much. It's kind of taken for granted.
Yeah, and I think we also see silent film today as being some kind of antiquated relic, that it really has nothing to say to us anymore. How can you watch such a thing? And unfortunately, that's because when silent films are shown, they're shown at the wrong speed or they're not synchronized to music, when almost every silent film that was shown was never really silent. Something else Lillian Gish said to me, she goes, we were never silent. She goes, we always had music. There was a way of telling a story that if people can only let go of their need for realism, complete and utter realism, some of those stories are really magical and deep and profound, as well as sometimes hysterically funny. I'm a great advocate for silent film, and I wish we could see it the way it's meant to be seen.
Here's the thing about home security companies. Most of them trap you with high prices, tricky contracts, and lousy customer support. So while there are a lot of options out there, there's only one no-brainer: SimpliSafe. U.S. News & World Report named SimpliSafe the best overall home security of 2020. And that's because SimpliSafe's got everything you need to protect your home with none of the drawbacks of traditional home security. It's got an arsenal of sensors and cameras to blanket every room, window, and door tailored specifically for your home. Professional monitoring keeps watch day and night, ready to send police, fire, or medical professionals if there's an emergency. And you can set it up yourself in under an hour. That's what I did. You just peel and stick the sensors exactly where you need them. No technician required. And all of this starts at just $15 a month. Try SimpliSafe today at simplisafe.com/Hollywoodland, all one word, and you'll get free shipping and a 60-day risk-free trial. There's nothing to lose. That's simplisafe.com/Hollywoodland. In the small town of Fox Lake, Illinois, Joe Glinowitz was a hometown hero and a 30-year veteran of the local police department. On September 1st, 2015, just 1 month from retirement, he was found dead outside of an abandoned cement plant, shot in the chest twice at close range. While the town and Joe's family mourned his passing, hundreds of police officers launched a manhunt to find his killer. After weeks of searching, the lead investigator discovered chilling secrets about Joe, the local police department, and the village of Fox Lake. Secrets that, once uncovered, would put the town in the national spotlight and haunt them for years to come. Wondery's shocking true crime podcast, Over My Dead Body, is back for a third season with a story about corruption, betrayal, and the secrets of a fallen hero. Follow Over My Dead Body Season 3 Fox Lake on Apple Podcasts, or you can listen early and ad-free by subscribing to Wondery Plus in Apple Podcasts or the Wondery app. You know what I love so much about your book, Will, is that it really is a deep dive into old Hollywood, and it's a deep dive into that era. And it reads like a novel. It's so rich. And who would have guessed that William Desmond Taylor's murder, of course, that's the key part of your book, but you really open it up and you show us so much more about what was going on then.
That was my intention. When I first started to do this book, I wanted to tell the story of Hollywood from 1920 to 1925, because in those 5 years, all of the structures that would come to define the American film industry for the next 50 years were put into place. The way the films were made, the way that they were marketed, the way they were distributed, the way they were sold, the censorship arm of films comes in during this period of time. And I said to myself, if I can solve the murder of William Desmond Taylor, great, but I don't need to do that to tell this story, because I can use the murder as a way into how the studios structured themselves and how they built themselves and created this industry. I can use just the scandal of it. And I said, if I can solve the murder, then that's gravy. So it really was intended to be the story of Hollywood, the bigger story of Hollywood, and with the murder as a way in.
And it is truly one of the best books I've read on old Hollywood. And I wasn't expecting that when I started reading your book. I was expecting to be zeroed in on William Desmond Taylor, which, of course, an intriguing story, but all these other pieces that you add just make it a true joy to read. And Adolf Zukor, what a story.
Right. He's a great character.
What a creepy, as he was called.
Right.
Did he know that he was called creepy? Or did they do it behind his back?
I'm sure, they did it behind his backs, but I don't think there was nothing got past Zucker. He knew everything. But, I had to tell his story, and I had to tell the story of how the studios were being structured and how they were being invented in many ways, because only through understanding that can we understand why Taylor's murder mattered so much. It wasn't just an inconvenient scandal. At the very time he was killed, Roscoe Arbuckle I think he was in the middle of his second trial on manslaughter. Hollywood was enveloped in scandal, and they were facing not only boycotts and threats of boycotts from religious and social groups, they were also being targeted by the Federal Trade Commission on the fact that they were trusts, the accusation that they needed to break up all of the studios which were buying up movie theaters all over the country. So this was a crisis moment for this new industry that had made these mostly immigrant men into multimillionaires. And so everything was on the line. So only by understanding that and understanding exactly what Hollywood was going through at the moment can we understand why such care and such contrivances were used to cover up the killers of William Desmond Taylor. Why Zukor was allowing the killers to walk free, because if he had brought them to justice, it would have been far worse than the scandal itself, because what it would have revealed was that deep underbelly that you were mentioning, that was the social reformers suspected was at the heart of Hollywood, but couldn't quite prove. This would prove it if the reality of Taylor's killers was to come out. So I had to explain Hollywood. I had to explain the whole big picture for us to understand the effort that went into concealing this murder.
And there was so much money then. I mean, that money, of course, is at the center, right? I mean, they were making just enormous amounts of money.
Yeah. You have to think of that. Adolf Zucker came to these shores with literally nothing. I think he once said that all I had in my pockets was lint. So, he steps off the boat, an orphan, completely poor and desolate. And he makes himself into this hugely important figure, controlling this new media that had never existed before. We know that today. You know what happens when new media happens. And he was the Mark Zuckerberg of the day, or Steve Jobs. He had created this media that didn't exist before. And now he was reaping the profits from it. So he's a great character because he's essentially a good man and a man with vision. But he was not about to go back to being penniless.
Maybe that should be another book that you write, all about these guys. Because we look at these men in Hollywood, the studio executives, and look at them in such a negative way. But when you explain that piece of it, and what they had to go through to get to the top.
Oh, yeah.
There's this big story there. It's not like they just fell into it.
Yeah, I mean, and they came from nowhere. Zucker held the whole equation in his head. There was a line, I think, from Irving Thalberg at one point that said only a few people can hold the whole equation of motion pictures in their head. And Zucker was one of them. He knew how to make them, how to sell them, how to produce them. He knew everything. And not only that, he knew what was coming. He was anticipating what was down the road. I believe that in many ways the industry is still structured around the way Adolf Zucker had envisioned it. So these were men with vision, and complicated men they weren't entirely villains, though sometimes they did villainous things. But on the other hand, they gave us, some of the most beautiful motion pictures ever made. So I don't want to paint any of them with a broad brush.
Right, exactly. There's so much to that era. And I wonder what they would say today. What do you think they would say, looking at the industry?
Well, I think on one level, they'd be thrilled to see how much money it's making, because now it's not just movies, but it's streaming and it's television and it's Netflix. I mean, I'm sure that was part of their vision. They couldn't have imagined the specifics or the details, but they knew this was just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think on one level, they'd be really impressed by how much money they'd make, but they really cared about the product. They weren't making crap. They stood behind what they were making. It was about quality. And so I think they would probably be a little bit unhappy to see the amount of, the lower quality stuff that's out there. But overall, I think they'd say, yeah, we told you it was going to make this much money.
And in the end, it's all about the story. However that story gets out there.
Right.
Whether it's on a streaming platform, whether it's in one of the silent films back in the day, it's all about story.
It is, absolutely. And human stories and faces and personalities. And yes, it doesn't matter if it's on celluloid film or it's, streaming over the internet. These are still moving images that are telling stories about people. And that's really the same thing that we first saw the Lumiere brothers doing in 1896, or Georges Méliès with his trick films in Paris. So this is still the same thing. There's a direct line that can be drawn from then to now.
I find it so exciting to talk to people like you who are so passionate about old Hollywood as I am. And I often wonder, did we live back then? I always wonder. If you believe in that.
I sure wish I did.
I mean, there's this sort of a weird connection.
Yeah, right.
I was fascinated with the Garden of Allah. I'm sure, of course, you know about Garden of Allah.
Absolutely.
And it just has hooked me. It absolutely has hooked me. I feel like, was I there?
Right. Quite possibly. I know I often tell my students that if I could invent a time machine, I would go back to the 1920s. The 1920s. I mean, I'd get out before 1927. But what a time. All over the country, there was a sense of redefinition and redefining gender roles and sexuality, and women were going to work for the first time. And there was just such a freedom and a sense of possibility. You look at the Harlem Renaissance in New York. I mean, there was just, people were expressing themselves in such a authentic way. Of course, that all stops very, very abruptly with the coming of the Depression, and starting to scapegoat some of these people. But the films of the 1920s really reflect an exuberance of the culture that's just so fun to look and experience.
Absolutely. I would pick that era too. I absolutely would want to be there because I think you're right. There was so much possibility. And it's so funny. I live right off of Sunset Strip. And, of course, the rock and roll era was what everybody equates with the Sunset Strip. But really, the most interesting part of that timeline was the 20s and the 30s and what was going on. And it was so wild.
Right, sure.
So much more wild than the rock and roll.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
And people don't know that. They don't realize.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because it was so new. Everybody was out. Nobody had any models to follow. People were writing their own scripts. And Hollywood, I mean, to try to be as accurate as I could in the book, I would take old maps of Hollywood to see where the streets went in certain places. And I learned that things like Melrose Avenue it's still unpaved for much of it in the 1920s. And that there were big eucalyptus trees that just hung over the street. And you think about that street now and imagine it being this unpaved dirt road with big eucalyptus trees. It's almost staggering to realize this was a very, very different world.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely. Let me ask you before we wrap up here, I want to ask you about Taylor's daughter. Did you find out about her, Daisy, what happened to her?
She did get married, but she never had any children. So there's no descendants of Taylor to be found. I was hoping I might find like a great-great-grandchild or something. But no, she never had any children. I believe she died fairly young. And, I've always felt, and there's no strict evidence of this, just getting to know these people, that I believe that Taylor felt tremendous guilt for having abandoned her. And that was why he took such a paternal interest in many of his actresses, particularly Mabel Normand. I really think he saw Mabel as the daughter he'd left behind. And of course, she was missing her father. Understanding Taylor's daughter helped me understand Taylor's relationship with Mabel.
Yeah, that was a very tender, special relationship.
Yes.
And it's so sad with Mabel and the drugs.
Right.
I mean,
right.
and that's so indicative of that time, right? There's so
absolutely.
much of that.
One of the things I always like to say is that I feel Mabel should be remembered for more than just the drug problems. I really think she was somebody who ultimately triumphed, really kind of went on her own way. And she moves to New York, leaves Hollywood behind. And, she moves in with a literary crowd and is having a good time. And yes, she liked to go out and drink. But she got the criticism for it where the guys who were going out and drinking weren't criticized for that. That's what men do. But the fact that a woman was drinking and, with all of the literary bigwigs, well, she was still scorned for that. So I hope we remember Mabel as a triumphant figure rather than a tragic one.
Yes. I love that. Absolutely. So what's next for you? What next mystery are you wanting to solve? A Hollywood mystery?
Well, I do have my eye on a couple of Hollywood mysteries that my publisher and I are talking about. There's a couple of big ones that I've been wanting to tackle for a while, but we haven't decided on that. In the meantime, I have a book on Marlon Brando that's coming out in the fall, and it's called The Contender. It's the story of Marlon Brando, and I've been able to work with his estate to get his personal papers, so that's never been used before. And it's a very different take on Marlon Brando than has been given before, kind of understanding the man behind the legend, as they say. I think it's going to be a very different portrait of Brando that people have never seen before.
Do you just love diving into these projects? And do you feel like you get so immersed in the era that you get lost in it for a while?
Sure. What I love to do is dive in and find the stories that weren't told, or the stories that were told through the Hollywood publicity, lens. I mean, taking the stories and saying, what was really happening? What were people really thinking? And how did they come up with this? And that's always been my interest in looking at these stories and standing back and looking at it from a cultural perspective. Why did Brando mean so much to the culture? What did he do to the culture? How did he help shift the culture beyond just the typical stories about his great artistry, for example? I want to know what he meant and how he mattered.
Well, I'm definitely going to get that book. That sounds fascinating.
Thank you.
Well, it's been so great to talk to you, William. And once again, William's book is Tinseltown, Murder, Morphine and Madness at the Dawn of Hollywood. Great read. And I look forward to talking to you again. And I'm so glad that you were consulting on this series.
Thank you.
That was my conversation with historian William J. Mann. His book, Tinseltown, Murder, Morphine, and Madness at the Dawn of Hollywood, has a lot more stories about Hollywood and the way studios operated in the silent era. This was a special episode of Murder in Hollywoodland from Hollywood and Crime. If you like what you've been hearing, be sure to tell your friends and fans of true crime. We're counting on you to help us spread the word. This episode was produced by Katie Long. Murder in Hollywoodland was written by Elizabeth Cosin, produced and edited by Loredana Palavoda, with additional editing assistance by Leah Sutherland. Our consultant is William J. Mann. Executive producers are Marshall Louis, Stephanie Jens, and Hernan Lopez. For Wondery.